Some games are burdened with the unfortunate task of having to explain why they exist at all. In today's video, we're looking at LittleBigPlanet Karting, which is a kart racing game for PS3 developed by United Front Games. It's a game that can be very difficult to judge by its own merits, given the timing of its release and the presence of another shockingly similar game in the marketplace. And for that very reason, I haven't heard a single thing about this game since it was first released over 10 years ago, which makes it the perfect subject for a video like this. So let's dive right in. Some backstory: I was a pretty big fan of Modnation Racers when that first came out. It was actually one of the first PS3 games I ever played, since my console came bundled with a copy of LittleBigPlanet Game of the Year Edition, which at the time included a download code for the Modnation Racers beta, and I played the shit out of both of those games. Modnation Racers, for those who may not know, was a heavily stylized kart racing game for the PS3, which was advertised as a racing game where you could make your own levels. It had fairly robust character customization, and one of the coolest hub environments I had seen in a video game at that point. I mean, any game where you can move through an environment to choose different game modes will impress me right away, whether that's Mario Sunshine or Winnie the Pooh's Rumbly Tumbly Adventure. Seriously, that game's hub world was amazing. But Modnation Racers went even further and actually showed other online players driving around the lobby in real time, even before you joined a race. It was awesome. And given the presence of a level editor, Modnation Racers was widely described as LittleBigPlanet but for racing. And Sony leaned into this description. IGN called it this, GameSpot called it this, and the game was even given the same tagline as LBP: play, create, share. Weirdly, the PlayStation blog somewhat hyperbolically referred to Modnation Racers as continuing the play, create, and share movement, as though the words themselves were a global rallying cry, and that gamers had never been able to share custom levels online before LittleBigPlanet happened, which obviously wasn't the case. But to be fair, things like custom Unreal Tournament levels required a certain level of competence with 3D map editor tools, which can be a high barrier to entry. By contrast, a game like Modnation Racers, or LittleBigPlanet, made it all much more accessible. The first LittleBigPlanet was a pretty big hit for Sony, particularly given the PS3's famously small library of games in its first couple of years, so I'd imagine they wanted to replicate that success, which is presumably why they started branding other games with the play, create, share tagline. Oddly enough, this is actually something that Nintendo tried doing back in the NES days by putting the programmable series graphic on the front of games that let you customize the experience in some way. And much like Nintendo's programmable series would ultimately just consist of Excitebike and 2 other games, Sony's Play, Create, Share tagline would appear on a select few other titles before it kinda just became marketing copy for the LittleBigPlanet sequels. Which is all to say, in the marketing push for Modnation Racers, Sony described that game as the racing equivalent of LittleBigPlanet. And I know it sounds like I'm repeating myself, but it's really important to remember how that game was discussed in mainstream gaming journals and comments by the game's own developers as we ramp up to the eventual announcement of LittleBigPlanet Karting. Because it raised the exact same question to virtually everyone who paid attention, and that is, why? Why would Sony publish a game that's clearly trying to be the racing equivalent of LittleBigPlanet, and then turn around and make an actual LittleBigPlanet racing game less than 2 years later? And curiously, both games were developed by the same studio and even had most of the same staff. So what gives? And so I began writing this video sort of with that question in mind. Is there anything interesting to be said about LittleBigPlanet Karting? Does it try to be its own thing, or is it just the Modnation engine with a new texture pack? So after doing some research, hearing from a few of the game's devs over email, and giving both Modnation Racers and LittleBigPlanet Karting another playthrough, I can honestly say that I found an answer to the whole question of why. And in fact, having also revisited the mainline LittleBigPlanet series after nearly a decade, I have a much better sense of what the whole franchise was ultimately trying to accomplish, and how that relates to the game's spiritual successor, the PS4 title Dreams, because there's actually quite a bit of overlap there. So in this video, we're going to look at what I think of LBP Karting now and whether I enjoy it on its own terms, what, if anything, makes this game different from Modnation Racers, how this game came to exist, the circumstances of its development and the ensuing public reaction, and finally, the state of create-your-own-level types of gaming experiences today, how this genre has changed significantly since the early 2010s, and why the LittleBigPlanet series feels like a relic from a bygone era, to which we may never fully return. So here we go. It's an odd thing to try and describe LittleBigPlanet karting on its own terms and bury the massive lead. This game's like an optical illusion that I look at, trying to see the duck instead of the rabbit, and for the longest time, all I was seeing was Modnation Racers, but with Sackboy. And with that preamble out of the way, I'm gonna try my darndest and talk about LittleBigPlanet as its own game. Unfortunately, as of my producing this video, the servers for all PS3 LittleBigPlanet games have been shut down, so I can only review this game's story mode and level editor. To that end, here's what I think. LittleBigPlanet karting is an impressive piece of tech. Based on old footage from other YouTube channels, the level editor is incredibly flexible, to the point that item pickup graphics can even be changed, and you can actually break the format of racing itself in some very interesting ways. You don't even have to make a racing game in LBP karting, and some of the early reviews talk about a developer-made tower defense level, although no footage seems to exist of that. As you'd expect, a great deal of community levels seem to have just been recreations of popular Mario Kart levels, but that's no fault of the developers. The tools themselves seem to have been quite powerful. So this game really lives up to the premise of a LittleBigPlanet racing game. You can make pretty much whatever you want. But here's the catch. In my opinion, the racing itself just isn't very good. And this is something that relates back to LittleBigPlanet as a franchise. The controls in mainline LittleBigPlanet games have famously been described as floaty, and I couldn't agree more. In a game like Super Mario Bros. 3, or to a much more extreme degree Super Meat Boy, indicating a direction on the D-pad leads to the on-screen character's movement in a matter of frames. You press right, and he goes right, almost instantly. In LittleBigPlanet, on the other hand, it always feels like you're struggling to build momentum. Sackboy just kind of floats around and you suggest a direction. There's a gap between what I'm pressing and what's happening on screen. And this isn't necessarily a bad thing. One could even argue that LBP's physics have to be floaty because of the focus on player-made content. The controls can't be precise because that encourages a more precise kind of platforming and thus nudges players to build levels around the game's physics, which leads to more uniformity in the creations. Mario Maker, for example, has the precision of the early NES Mario games, so anyone making a level is implicitly aware of how many little grid squares Mario is able to clear with a jump and how that changes based on momentum from running. In a way, Mario Maker encourages players to design levels that feel an awful lot like the official Super Mario Bros. Levels, just, maybe a bit more chaotic. LittleBigPlanet works by different logic. That Mario-like precision is missing, so everything feels floaty, and as a result, it kind of feels like you could make any kind of level with these tools. Whatever idea you have for a level, it'll probably work. And most LBP levels don't rely on precise platforming mechanics anyway. It's all much more to do with experimentation on the part of the designer, and the act of playing through a level feels a lot more like looking at someone else's art. You're playing through a level, sure, but you're also admiring the design choices as a core part of the experience. This very much happens to be the case with LittleBigPlanet karting. Make no mistake, the controls in LBP karting are floaty. That same pushing a balloon feeling has been translated into the kart racing genre almost verbatim. In fact, sometimes it feels like you don't even have a whole lot of say in what the character does at all. When I'm heading for an obstacle, for example, it feels like there's nothing I can input through the controller that will help avoid impact. The collision seems inevitable. And this is in stark contrast to Modnation Racers, which has tight, precise karting mechanics. Whatever happens is on you. Heck, in Modnation, you can even save up drifting points to help block other people's attacks. And to a lesser degree, the same is true of the larger titans of the kart racing genre, that being Mario Kart and Crash Team Racing. Those games have very precise controls. So, is this my favorite way to control a game? It really isn't. But someone must enjoy these kind of controls, because the LittleBigPlanet franchise has had a pretty decent run, and despite my objections, I've had a lot of fun with all kinds of different levels in the series, both developer-made and from the community. Again, I like these games quite a lot. I'm not shitting on LittleBigPlanet. I just wish the controls were more immediately responsive. Alright, now that I've said a bunch of slightly mean things about the game, let's talk about what LBP karting does right. Firstly, the battle mode rules. The weapons in this game got quite a lot of heat from critics for being uninspired or having an inconsistent theme. But in battle mode, the weapons make sense. There's different kinds of projectiles, this lightning attack that hits nearby players, and some weird poison shooter thing that never actually hits. Once I got the hang of things, this actually became my favorite part of the game. In particular, the battle arenas were really nicely designed, arguably better than the racing levels. They allow for a nice mix of the chaotic and the familiar. I actually kind of hate Mario Kart's battle mode, which is saying a lot since Mario Kart Wii might be one of my favorite video games. But I just never enjoyed the battle mode in that series. I did, however, always have a good time with Twisted Metal, and lo and behold, LittleBigPlanet Karting's battle arenas give me a bit of a Twisted Metal vibe. And that's a good thing. Hitting other players with the projectiles can be quite a challenge in of itself, and the arenas usually play with verticality or some sort of bouncing between smaller areas within the main level. Sure, a few of the story mode battle levels might look similar to the Mario Kart 64 block fort level, but for whatever reason, I had a lot more fun in LittleBigPlanet Karting's battle stages. And then, to LBP Karting's credit, it accomplishes something that many kart racing games have attempted, but which I've never seen done in a particularly interesting way, and that is boss fights. I've played a few racing games that toy with the boss fight premise. Diddy Kong Racing and F-Zero GX both come to mind, and both are great games to be sure. But no matter how they play with the format, their boss fights are always just a one-on-one race. That's it. But in LittleBigPlanet Karting, because of the versatility of the LBP level editing tools, other kinds of gamification are built into the identity of the franchise itself. And there's some sweet boss battles that incorporate weapons or even context-sensitive controls, so these levels can fundamentally play different from the rest of the game. So, credit where credit is due, LittleBigPlanet Karting has some of the most interesting, format-breaking boss battles I've seen in a kart racer. Finally, there's the level editor. This thing is way more elaborate than it needs to be. We'll talk more about this near the end of the video, but Modnation Racers level editor mostly consisted of drawing a track with the cement mixer tool, which essentially controls like racing but slower, and then you drop some obstacles and decorations or have the game do that for you. With LittleBigPlanet Karting, all those same tools carry over, but with an absurd level of control. To give you an idea of just how immediately complicated this thing is, if you were to copy the same level creation steps from Modnation Racers to LittleBigPlanet Karting, the resulting level wouldn't even default to having racing mechanics. You literally have to add other racers and rules for the track and other instructions before you have a level that consists of racing. And this is most likely because LBP Karting doesn't even want to assume you're making a racetrack. Truly, these tools are so open-ended you can make almost any kind of game you want, and we'll talk more about that later. So here is one last thing for my review portion of this video. LBP Karting was released around the time that Sony was pushing the PlayStation Move upon a mostly indifferent gaming market. And as it happens, this is one of maybe 5 games that officially supports the PlayStation Move Racing Wheel controller, which is exactly what it sounds like. But let me be clear, you can't actually just take a PlayStation Move controller and play LBP Karting with it. You literally need the racing wheel accessory to use motion controls, because the Move controller itself doesn't have buttons on its bottom half. Apparently they were trying to steal Nintendo's thunder without observing any of the features that made the Wii Remote a usable controller, such as being able to hold it sideways. It's a classic Sony move that reeks of design by committee. For what it's worth, the PlayStation Move Racing Wheel defaults to outputting its motion data as left analog stick movement, so virtually any racing game is playable with it, although it's only officially supported in LBP Karting, Gran Turismo 5, and a few other games. It's a strange feature all around, but if you're able to track down the extremely specific equipment that makes it all work, hey, I thought it was pretty decent. So that's what I thought of LittleBigPlanet Karting. At best, it's a robust games creation tool with some story mode levels that play around with the kart racing medium in fun ways, often harkening back to things like Twisted Metal and Diddy Kong Racing. But at worst, LittleBigPlanet Karting is a racing game where the racing sucks. And that's not as much of a death sentence as you'd think, but it does feel extreme to say out loud. So, with all that in mind, let's look at how this game differs from Modnation Racers, how this thing exists to begin with, and the future of DIY style video games. Alright, let's revisit the big question. All the reviews of the era will either mention Modnation Racers in passing, or try to talk about this game in a vacuum, in ways that just feel awkward. This quote from Game Informer actually sums up a lot of my frustrations. The existence of LittleBigPlanet Karting is a bit of a head scratcher. It sort of already exists in the form of Modnation Racers, and to make matters more confusing, it was made by the same development team. And that's kind of getting to the heart of the issue. So what the hell is this game? Truth be told, when I started making this video, I was ready to give it a nice clickbaity title like the Modnation sequel nobody wanted, or why does LittleBigPlanet Karting exist? Something along those lines, with a nice little thumbnail of me crossing my arms in front of the Sackboy picture. But I didn't want this video to just be an extended roast of a video game that real people spent time making and which honestly is a pretty fun game in its own right. So I challenged myself to really look at the game, give it an honest chance, and see if there was much to say. And honestly, after a few hours of playing LittleBigPlanet Karting and then revisiting Modnation Racers, I can confidently say that I finally see the difference. Yeah, it's still a kart racing game where you build your own levels, but if I had to make a broad strokes declaration on what makes these two games different, it's this. Modnation Racers is a kart racing game where you design your own track layouts, while LittleBigPlanet Karting, much like the other LBP sequels, aspires to become a fully fledged game creation system. There's so much more customization, not just in terms of what the levels look like, but how the game controls, the win-lose conditions, and everything we've come to associate with game design choices. Going back and making a Modnation level after trying out LBP Karting's level designer, I couldn't help but feel that Modnation's level editor really just lets you draw the overall line of the racetrack and the game would handle the rest. Sure, you could manually place the decorations and obstacles if you wanted, but when it comes down to it, you're still racing toward a finish line, doing some laps, and using the stock weapons. By comparison, LittleBigPlanet Karting's level editor doesn't even default to a playable racing experience. You have to tell the game you're making a kart racer. We'll talk more about this in part 4, but basically, LittleBigPlanet started as a platformer game where you design levels, as is the case in the first entry, but it quickly turned into more of a game design system with no particular genre in mind. For example, when LittleBigPlanet 2 came out, I remember seeing a lot of buzz about how someone had recreated the first dungeon from Zelda NES in the LBP2 level editor, complete with sprite graphics and similar controls. This felt like a massive leap forward at the time. Something had changed between the first and second LittleBigPlanet games, and it's something that really only makes sense with the added context of what Media Molecule has done in the ensuing years. At any rate, LittleBigPlanet Karting runs with the advancements from LBP2, giving players the tools to make basically any kind of experience. So I have to ask, why even make a spin-off game at all? By this point in the LittleBigPlanet series, you could already make a racing game as a self-contained level in LBP2. You could even make something that feels like Mario Kart if you wanted. And I guess that's my question with Media Molecule's work in general, which is, the tools clearly go far beyond simple level editors, to the point that they start to rival things like Unreal Editor and Unity. So when you end up with something like Dreams, which is completely open-ended and you can basically make anything, where do you go from there? What would a Dreams 2 even include to evolve the premise? And with that question in mind, let's take a look at how LittleBigPlanet Karting came to exist as a commercial product. In preparation for this video, I reached out to as many of the game's developers as I reasonably could to hear about the process behind this game, and the response was pretty telling. I got more than a few replies from people who very kindly told me they didn't remember a whole lot about making LittleBigPlanet Karting. Now, that could be due to the game's age, or they may just have not wanted to do an interview, which is totally understandable, but in my experience, people usually want to talk about their creative projects, even for an obscure YouTube video like this one, so ruling out weird conspiracy theories, what seems most likely, in my opinion, is that this game actually just wasn't super memorable to work on. After all, most of the same team had just wrapped Modnation Racers, and a huge part of the making of LBP Karting seems to have involved reformatting those tools to accommodate existing assets from LittleBigPlanet. Not exactly a super inspiring task. To quote developer Peter Lawley, who was very generous with his time and answering my questions, when it came to comparing the two games, quote, "Modnation is my favorite because it's the first and was built from scratch. We put a lot of hard work into all the tools and racing experience, which made it really stand out from anything before it." And honestly, that lines up with what I would expect, which is that Modnation was such a novel concept at the time that it must have been much more memorable than doing the same thing but with someone else's IP. And on that note, I had read a few loose tweets which claimed that a planned Modnation Racers sequel had actually morphed into LittleBigPlanet Karting. And Peter confirmed this, saying, "We started working on Modnation Racers 2 with Sony, and after a few months pivoted to LBPK since they thought the brand was a good fit for the game." And again, it seems like a great deal of time and effort was spent reshaping the Modnation sequel into a LittleBigPlanet game. In particular, Peter Lawley's focus on UI development speaks to one of the most immediately apparent differences between the two games. Quote, "We used a completely different system, and making them feel the same required rewriting large portions of our codebase and almost entirely throwing away all of the design and art." Based on press quotes at the time, United Front Games seems to have made Modnation Racers as their own project, and landed on doing it as a PS3 exclusive because of the console's online capabilities and technical prowess. The argument seems to be that because PSN multiplayer was free, more people could access the online mode. I understand the logic of this, but I'm curious if there's data to back this up. There's also this weird sentence about the PSN having a very strong community, which, speaking as a total PS3 fanboy who was active during this era, it really wasn't. Xbox Live felt like the place to be, and PSN was lagging behind in some important ways. At any rate, once it became a PS3 exclusive, Sony helped to market the shit out of this thing. And then, with that existing partnership in place, Sony encouraged United Front to turn their Modnation sequel into a LittleBigPlanet spin-off game, and the hype machine was fired up once more. On release, LittleBigPlanet Karting got mixed reviews. PlayStation-focused outlets were kinder than others, which is no surprise, but by all accounts, this game just didn't sell all that well. I couldn't find any hard sales figures that didn't immediately read as made up, and not a whole lot has been said about this game in the ensuing years by anyone, but I'd point to the lack of any follow-up titles, such as a PSP or Vita port, as possible evidence for this game underperforming in the marketplace. So that's how the development and release of this game all went. So, where are they now? Not, the LittleBigPlanet kart racing games, but the whole make-your-own-game genre. As I said earlier, I've always understood LittleBigPlanet to be a platform game in which you make your own levels, and that the level editor was sophisticated enough to make works of the same quality as the developer-made levels in story mode. What I didn't know at the time, and what I'm realizing all these years later, is that LittleBigPlanet's intentions go far beyond a platformer game where you make your own levels. The series would, eventually, more closely resemble a full-on minigame creation tool, and one which defied any sense of genre. This was novel at the time. Player-generated content. It was a bit of a buzzword. Online gaming was new-ish, at least on home consoles, as was the premise that levels created by community members could be treated with the same level of legitimacy as levels made by actual developers. The elephant in the room, of course, is that this is exactly what games like Roblox and Fortnite Creative have come to embrace, certainly to great financial success, but arguably at the cost of having to accept that an awful lot of really shitty interactive experiences with a dubious grasp on the word game have captured the imagination of seemingly everyone under the age of 10. This leads, of course, into Media Molecule's next project after the LittleBigPlanet series, Dreams. This is unabashedly, unambiguously a content creation tool in which users can make completely original interactive works, or non-interactive works. You can make a movie if you want to. There's a first-person Seinfeld psychological horror title. There's a recreation of Sonic 06 or something like that. Someone made a puppet show. I had spent all these years understanding LittleBigPlanet as a game where you can drop enemies and stickers along a 2D path, but the truth was much more complex. Media Molecule's whole gaming philosophy had evolved into something less like StarCraft's level editor and more like the Unreal editor. And whereas LittleBigPlanet's original competition was arguably something like New Super Mario Bros. At a time when 2D platforming mechanics were a little unpopular in AAA development, the PS4 title Dreams has to compete with a slew of other game creation tools, most of which, frankly, are a lot better. And as I sift through the player-generated content in Dreams, I obviously can't help but scoff at some of the badly made creations that flood the service, But to a much greater degree, I'm more baffled by the creations I see that are good. This looks great, I think. Why on earth would you choose to make this in Dreams? After all, in Dreams, everything you make is locked into that ecosystem. I don't mean to dismiss the enormous difficulty of porting a game between engines, but at least when you're moving between Unity and Unreal, there's open standards for model files, textures, audio, things like that. And it takes some finessing to get the materials looking the same way, but you know what I mean. For a game made in Dreams, everything has to be built in-engine, including the models, and nothing can be exported. Your work stays there. This topic is actually covered quite well in Cameron Kunzelman's Waypoint article, Dreams is a Powerful Tool to Create Anything and Own Nothing, where he goes into some of the more abstract questions of labor and intellectual property in a service that relies on being a walled garden in which nothing can be imported or exported. In response to two other game journalists comparing Dreams to an artist commune and even Minecraft, Kunzelman writes, quote, Dreams isn't an artistic commune because nothing you build can leave. It isn't Minecraft because Dreams' existence on the PlayStation 4 means that while you can build templates inside of the game itself, building mods or creating texture packs, two things that made Minecraft explode, just aren't in the cards. In reality, it's a lot like something completely different. Social media platforms. Which is all to say, games made in Dreams will disappear forever when those servers go down, at least in terms of their ability to be shared among other PlayStation owners, as was the case with LittleBigPlanet karting levels or Modnation Racer tracks. Those are gone. To their credit, Media Molecule eventually came out and explicitly stated that works created in Dreams are the property of the players who make them, and not Media Molecule itself. It's a good thing they said this, but they've also done something quite horrible. Media Molecule has ended support for Dreams, which makes sense, but in a final series of blog posts, they explicitly stated that Dreams creations cannot be exported to other formats. Just for the record, home consoles don't use any magical code or proprietary model formats. Every game model you've ever seen was made in either Maya or 3ds Max. These things aren't made of spiders and fairy dust, they're computers running on the same silicon as anything else. At the risk of getting too technical, the PS4's GPU may share memory with the CPU in a way that home PCs usually don't, but it's still a GPU. It uses sets of coordinates to produce triangles, and then textures them according to UVW maps. Everything you see in 3D is a model file made of polygons, and Dreams is no exception. Again, I'm not saying it's easy to go between engines, but open standards do exist, and Media Molecule should really be criticized for how they're handling this. But I can't help but look back at Cameron Kunzelman's 2019 article with some amount of sadness. To be clear, he was asking important questions, and I'm glad he wrote the article the way he did. But in hindsight, there's just something sad about discussing a game's level editor with such explicitly commercial terms. At the risk of going way off topic, I can't help but lament the increased commercialization of the internet, and in particular, the way almost all web traffic has been moved from millions of blogs and individual websites and into a small handful of social media apps that are centralized, and their content is sorted according to what will eventually lead to the most ad revenue for the platforms themselves. I know this seems like an obvious fact, but I really want you to think about that. The way you interact with your best friends is through a service that needs to place your thoughts and feelings and secrets next to a fucking Arby's ad. That's weird, isn't it? And Cameron Kunzelman even explores this in his article, writing, quote, Facebook needs you to argue with your great uncle about politics so it can know who you are, what you feel, and what those identifiers might make you likely to purchase. And he is correct. Which is all to say, bringing it back, the LittleBigPlanet model feels like something of a relic from the final days of an internet where creativity was celebrated for its own sake. And watching the opening cutscene of LittleBigPlanet, it kind of brings a tear to my eye because it's so celebratory of creativity and human thought. And I can't help but wonder, have we just lost that forever? There's been some discussion on how Media Molecule's Dreams has a defined lack of players across the board. Not a whole lot of people are making things in Dreams, and not a whole lot of people are playing the levels that do exist. In many ways, Dreams is a victim of the times. LittleBigPlanet, as a series, hasn't seen a numbered entry in what is going on a full decade. Roblox and Fortnite Creative, on the other hand, games with explicitly defined revenue streams and profit-sharing models, are more popular than ever. And if you look at the top levels in Fortnite Creative on a given day, this list isn't representative of what's the most fun to play, but oftentimes, what's the most fun to watch someone play. Because Fortnite creators are making games with streamers in mind, who themselves pick games that will allow them to have big, exaggerated reactions to entertain an audience who will probably never play the game anyway, and this affects the way these levels are made, and the cycle goes on endlessly. Can I just say, I fucking hate that this is what it's all come to, and that's probably why we haven't seen a new LittleBigPlanet game in quite some time, or why Sony isn't pushing the play, create, share tagline anymore, and that's a sad thing. I don't really have a good way to end this section of the video, it sucks. I hate it here.
Unbelievable, you lost a level.
Wow, sorry to end this video on such a downer thought, everyone. In closing, I'd just like to say that LittleBigPlanet Karting, for me, represents a turning point for the LBP series in that it's still trying to hold on to its genre roots, but the tools are very clearly heading in the direction of a full-blown game engine. My intro to the LittleBigPlanet series, that being the PSP entry, has very little to do with what the series would ultimately become, for better or worse. I'm sure Media Molecule saw the writing on the wall and realized they couldn't just keep making the platformer equivalent of Halo's Forge mode, at least when their game doesn't sell as many units as a Halo entry, so they tried going a few steps further, which unfortunately puts them in competition with companies like Unity and Epic Games, while not really being a whole lot more user-friendly. It's a strange place to operate and probably wasn't a good choice. Between LittleBigPlanet Karting and Modnation Racers, I still prefer Modnation Racers in almost every way. And if there's a clear takeaway from this video, it's that Modnation is a game worth revisiting for its precise karting mechanics and robust character creation. I can't recommend that game enough. LBP Karting, on the other hand, is still a racing game where the racing sucks, and while its level editor is incredibly versatile, you can do a lot of those same things in LittleBigPlanet 3 or even in Dreams. So it's hard to point to this game and find anything LittleBigPlanet Karting does better than anyone else. So that's what I thought. And that's the video. Thanks for watching. Huge shout out to Peter Lawley for answering all my questions over email. Huge thanks to the entire LittleBigPlanet community on YouTube for archiving footage of all these levels, which are essentially just lost media at this point, which is kind of a sad thought. And I guess we're ending the video on that sombering note. Yeah, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.